The dust settled on Clara Montgomery's worn boots as she stepped onto the wooden planks of Dawson's General Store in Silver Creek, Montana Territory, this scorching afternoon of July 1883, her heart hammering with the knowledge that she had exactly $3.47 to feed herself and her younger brother for the next 2 weeks. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and every head in that cramped space turned toward her with eyes that burned hotter than the summer sun outside, faces twisting into expressions she had learned to recognize over the past 3 months since her father's murder, and the whispers had started spreading through town like wildfire. Clara kept her chin high despite the trembling in her hands as she moved through the store, selecting only the barest necessities: a small sack of flour, some dried beans, a tin of lard, and a few strips of jerky. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders as Mrs. Henderson clutched her basket closer and stepped away, as if poverty and scandal were contagious diseases that might transfer through the very air between them. The other customers formed a wall of hostility so thick she could hardly breathe through it, but she forced herself to keep moving, to gather what she needed, to pretend that their cold shoulders and whispered words did not cut her like knives. When she finally approached the counter with her meager selections, Harold Dawson looked up from his ledger with eyes gone hard as flint. He was a portly man with a gray mustache that twitched when he was angry, and it was twitching now as he took in the sight of her standing before him with her humble purchases lined up on the scarred wooden surface. "I cannot serve you," he said, his voice carrying through the sudden silence of the store with the finality of a judge's gavel. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet. "I have money, Mr. Dawson. I can pay for everything I have selected." "I do not care if you have gold bars in your pockets, Miss Montgomery. I will not have the daughter of a claim jumper and a horse thief spending ill-gotten gains in my establishment. You can take your business elsewhere." The words hit her like physical blows, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "My father was not a thief. Those accusations were never proven, and he died before he could defend himself against those lies." "The proof was found in his cabin after he was shot," Dawson said coldly. "Property deeds that belonged to the Masterson family, horses bearing brands from 3 different ranches. The territorial marshal himself confirmed it." "Those items were planted," Clara said, her voice rising despite her best efforts to remain calm. "My father was an honest miner who filed his claim legally. Someone murdered him and staged evidence to steal his land." "That is not what the law determined," Dawson replied, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Now I will ask you to leave my store before I have Sheriff Coleman remove you forcibly." Clara looked around the store desperately, seeking even one sympathetic face among the gathered townspeople, but found only cold stares and satisfied smirks. These were people she had known all her life, people her father had helped when they needed it, people who had smiled and waved just 4 months ago. Now they looked at her as if she were something scraped off the bottom of a boot. "Please," she whispered, hating the desperation in her voice but unable to hide it. "My brother is only 14 years old. We have nothing. Our cabin is barely standing, and someone burned down our barn last week. I just need enough food to get us through until I can find work." "You should have thought about that before your father decided to become a criminal," Mrs. Henderson said from behind her, voice dripping with self-righteous satisfaction. "The sins of the father fall upon the children, as the good book says." Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, anger burning through the humiliation. "The good book also speaks of mercy and compassion, Mrs. Henderson, but I suppose those lessons did not take root in your heart." "How dare you?" Mrs. Henderson sputtered, her face turning an unbecoming shade of purple. "That is quite enough," Dawson said sharply. "Miss Montgomery, I will give you to the count of 5 to vacate these premises, or I will make good on my threat to involve the sheriff." The front door opened at that moment, and Clara's vision was swimming with tears of rage and shame as she heard boot heels strike the wooden floor with measured, confident steps. She could not bring herself to look at whoever had entered, could not bear to see another face filled with contempt for her. "I reckon there is some kind of trouble here," a deep voice said. the accent marking him as someone from further south, perhaps Texas or Oklahoma territory. "That does not sit right with me, seeing as how this is supposed to be a place of business, not a courtroom." Clara finally looked up and found herself staring at the tallest man she had ever seen outside of a dime novel. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that strained against a faded blue shirt, and a face that was all hard planes and sun-weathered skin beneath a black hat pushed back to reveal dark hair and eyes the color of warm honey. He could not have been much older than her own 22 years, perhaps 25 at most, and there was something in the easy way he carried himself that spoke of confidence earned through trial rather than borrowed from privilege. "This is not your concern, stranger," Dawson said, though his voice had lost some of its harsh edge. "This is a private matter between myself and this young woman." "Well, I am making it my concern," the cowboy said pleasantly, though Clara could hear steel beneath the honey-smooth drawl. "Seems to me that a store is a public establishment, and if the lady has money to pay, then refusing her service is not just unchristian, it is downright cruel." "You do not understand the situation," Mrs. Henderson interjected, stepping forward with her bosom thrust out like the prow of a ship. "This girl's father was a thief and a scoundrel. We have every right to refuse to do business with his family." The cowboy's eyes swept over Mrs. Henderson with an expression of such profound disinterest that the woman actually took a step back. Then his gaze returned to Clara, and she found herself unable to look away from the unexpected kindness she saw there. "What is your name?" he asked her directly, ignoring everyone else in the store as if they had suddenly ceased to exist. "Clara Montgomery," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well, Miss Montgomery, my name is James Bridger, and I would consider it an honor if you would allow me to purchase your supplies for you." He turned to Dawson before she could protest. "In fact, I will be buying everything Miss Montgomery selected, plus another month's worth of provisions: flour, sugar, coffee, bacon, dried fruit, canned goods, and whatever else a family would need to get by comfortably." "Now see here," Dawson began, but James cut him off with a look that could have frozen the Missouri River in August. "I am a paying customer, am I not? And unless you have some policy against selling to cowboys who have just been paid after a 3-month cattle drive, I expect you to fill my order promptly and without further comment on matters that are none of your concern." The store had gone so quiet that Clara could hear the buzzing of a fly against the front window and the creaking of the floorboards as James moved to stand beside her at the counter. He smelled of leather and horse and the open range, and his presence felt like a shield between her and all the hatred pressing in from every side. Dawson's face had turned an alarming shade of red, but he was a businessman first and a moral crusader second. The promise of a significant sale warred visibly with his desire to punish Clara, and commerce won out as it so often did. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, "but the girl does not touch anything. You make your purchases, and you can do with them what you please once you leave my store." James's smile did not reach his eyes. "That suits me just fine." For the next 20 minutes, Clara stood in stunned silence as James methodically ordered supplies that would feed her and her brother Thomas for weeks. He added things she had not even thought to hope for: a whole ham, tins of peaches and tomatoes, real white sugar, and even a small bag of peppermint sticks that made her throat tighten with remembered childhood joys. The other customers filtered out gradually, unwilling to watch their moral stand get undermined by a stranger's generosity, until only Clara and James remained while Dawson and his clerk boxed up the purchases with ill grace. "You do not have to do this," Clara finally found her voice to say quietly. "This is too much. I cannot possibly repay you." James glanced at her with those honey-colored eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Did I ask for repayment? No, but I cannot accept charity from a stranger. I have my pride, Mr. Bridger, even if that is all I have left." "Then do not think of it as charity," he said easily, leaning against the counter with a casual grace that made her heart do strange things in her chest. "Think of it as one human being helping another because it is the right thing to do. Think of it as me buying supplies that I plan to share with someone I hope might become a friend. You do not know anything about me," Clara protested weakly. "You do not know what people are saying, what they believe my father did." "I know that you stood up for yourself with dignity when you were being treated shamefully," James replied, his voice dropping lower so that only she could hear. "I know that you are trying to take care of your younger brother in circumstances that would break most people, and I know that mob mentality and truth are often strangers to each other. That is enough for me." Clara felt tears burning in her eyes again, but these were different from the bitter tears of humiliation she had fought back earlier. These were born of gratitude and relief, and something else she could not quite name, something warm and fragile and terrifying in its intensity. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly on the question. James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were looking at something beyond the walls of the general store. "Because 3 years ago I watched my sister get treated much the same way in a small town in Texas after her husband was killed, and people decided she must have been complicit in his gambling debts. I was working a ranch 200 miles away and did not learn what had happened until it was too late. She starved herself to feed her children, and when I finally got to her, she was so weak with fever and malnutrition that she died 2 days later." His jaw tightened, and Clara saw old pain flicker across his features. "I swore then that I would never stand by and watch someone else suffer that kind of cruelty if I could prevent it." "I am so sorry," Clara whispered, her hand reaching out before she could stop herself to touch his arm gently. "That should never have happened to her." "No, it should not have," James agreed, looking down at her small hand on his forearm with an expression she could not read. "But it did, and I cannot change the past. I can only try to do better in the present." Dawson cleared his throat loudly, clearly uncomfortable with the intimate conversation happening at his counter. "Your total comes to $47.30. James pulled out a worn leather wallet and counted out the bills without hesitation, adding an extra $1. "For your trouble," he said dryly, in a tone that suggested he considered Dawson's trouble to be entirely self-inflicted. The supplies filled 4 large wooden crates, and James hefted 2 of them as if they weighed nothing at all. "If you can point me toward your home, Miss Montgomery, I would be happy to help you carry these supplies there." Clara picked up her skirts with one hand and reached for one of the remaining crates with the other, but James shook his head. "I will come back for those. No need for you to strain yourself." "Mr. Bridger, I have been carrying water, chopping wood, and doing manual labor for 3 months now. I am stronger than I look." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, a real one this time, that made his entire face transform from merely handsome to something that made her breath catch. "I do not doubt that for a second, Miss Montgomery, but humor me anyway." There was something in his tone that was not quite a request and not quite an order, something that made her feel cared for rather than diminished. So she nodded and led the way out of the store into the blazing afternoon sun. The main street of Silver Creek stretched before them, a wide dirt thoroughfare lined with false-fronted buildings that had been painted and repainted so many times the original wood was barely visible. A few people moved along the boardwalks, and Clara felt their eyes tracking her progress with the strange cowboy, felt the whispers starting up again like summer locusts. "I live about a mile outside of town," she said quietly, gesturing toward the road that led into the foothills where the less prosperous residents made their homes. "It is a bit of a walk?" "I have a horse," James said, nodding toward a magnificent buckskin gelding tied at the hitching rail. The animal was tall and well-muscled, with intelligent eyes that watched their approach with interest. "Duke can carry these supplies while we walk alongside. It will be easier that way." He secured the crates to the saddle with practiced efficiency, using ropes that he produced from his saddlebags as if he had anticipated exactly this scenario. Clara watched the sure movements of his hands, the easy confidence with which he handled both horse and cargo, and found herself wondering who James Bridger really was beneath the white knight exterior. "You can ride if you prefer," James offered as they started down the dusty road, Duke following behind like a faithful dog. "I am accustomed to walking." "So am I," Clara replied, adjusting her bonnet against the fierce sun. "Thomas and I sold our horses 2 weeks ago to pay for medicine when he caught a fever. We have been making do on foot since then. Is your brother recovered now? Yes, thank God. He is strong, and the fever broke after 3 days, but it frightened me terribly. He is all I have left in this world. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps on the packed earth, the creak of saddle leather, and the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the mountains. The land stretched out around them in shades of gold and brown, sagebrush and prairie grass baking under the relentless summer heat, with the Rockies rising like jagged teeth on the western horizon. Will you tell me what really happened to your father? James asked finally, his voice gentle but direct. If you do not want to speak of it, I understand, but I find that sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter. Clara took a deep breath, tasting dust and dried grass on the back of her tongue. She had not talked about it with anyone except Thomas, had held all the grief and rage locked inside her chest like a cage around her heart. But something about this stranger made her want to trust him, want to unburden herself of secrets that had grown too heavy to carry alone. My father, William Montgomery, was a miner, she began slowly. He came to Montana Territory in 1876 during the gold rush, but he was never interested in striking it rich. He just wanted honest work and a way to provide for his family after my mother died of cholera. He filed a legitimate claim on a piece of land in the hills about 5 miles from here, and he worked it for 7 years. It never produced much gold, but it was enough to support Thomas and me, enough to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. What changed? James asked when she paused. About 6 months ago, the Masterson Mining Company started buying up all the small claims in the area. They offered good money, more than most of the independent miners could hope to make in several years of hard work. Most people sold willingly, but my father refused. He said the land was all he had to leave to Thomas and me, and he did not trust the Mastersons. He said they were the kind of men who would grind up the whole mountain and poison the rivers if it meant an extra dollar in their pockets. Clara kicked at a stone in the road, watching it skitter into the sagebrush. The Mastersons did not take his refusal well. They sent men to pressure him, to threaten him. They spread rumors about the quality of his claim, tried to say he was working played-out ground out of stubbornness. When that did not work, they offered more money, double what they had paid anyone else, but Papa still refused. And then he was killed, James said quietly. And then he was killed, Clara echoed, her voice flat with the weight of grief that never seemed to lighten. 4 months ago, I woke up to shouting. I looked out the window and saw 3 men on horseback in our yard. They were arguing with Papa. And then one of them pulled a gun. I screamed, and Thomas came running. But by the time we got outside, the men were riding away and Papa was lying in the dirt with blood spreading across his chest. Her voice broke, and she had to stop walking for a moment, had to press her hand against her mouth to hold back the sob that threatened to escape. James stopped beside her, not touching her, but standing close enough that she could feel the solid warmth of his presence, the unspoken offer of comfort. The sheriff came, she continued, when she could speak again. Sheriff Coleman. He looked at the scene, asked some questions, and then 2 days later he returned with the territorial marshal. They searched our cabin and found stolen property hidden in the loft. Deeds to land owned by the Mastersons, horses in our pasture that bore brands from other ranches, even gold coins that supposedly came from a robbery in Helena last year. They said my father had been a thief, and that he must have been killed by his partners in crime over a disagreement about dividing the spoils. But you do not believe that, James said, and it was not a question. I know it is not true, Clara said fiercely, looking up at him with eyes that blazed with conviction. My father was many things, but he was not a thief. Someone planted that evidence to justify his murder and to discredit any claims Thomas and I might make about who really killed him. And I'm certain it was the Mastersons or men working for them. Did you tell this to the marshal? Of course I did. I told everyone who would listen. But the Mastersons are rich and powerful, with connections to the territorial government. I am just the daughter of a dead miner with no proof and no resources. The marshal said the evidence spoke for itself, and the case was closed. 2 weeks later, a man showed up with papers claiming that our land had been sold to the Masterson Mining Company before Papa's death. that he had signed a deed of sale. The signature was forged. I would stake my life on it. But no one cared. We were given 30 days to vacate the property. Where are you living now? The old Hutchins cabin, about a quarter-mile from here. Mr. Hutchins died last winter with no heirs, and the place was sitting empty. Thomas and I moved in without asking permission because we had nowhere else to go. It is barely livable, but it keeps the rain off our heads for now. They had reached a fork in the road, and Clara gestured toward the narrower path that led up into the scrub-covered hills. The terrain grew rougher here, the soil rocky and poor, dotted with twisted juniper trees and clumps of tough grass. After another 10 minutes of walking, a small cabin came into view, its log walls grayed with age and weather, the roof patched with mismatched boards and bits of canvas. A gangly teenage boy was working in what might generously be called a garden, hacking at the hard ground with a hoe that looked older than he was. He looked up at the sound of their approach, and his eyes widened with alarm at the sight of Clara accompanied by a strange man. "Clara!" he called out, dropping the hoe and starting toward them at a run. "Are you all right? What happened?" "I am fine, Thomas," Clara assured him quickly as her brother reached them, slightly out of breath and covered in dust. "This is Mr. James Bridger. He helped me at the general store when Mr. Dawson refused me service." Thomas's young face darkened with anger, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "That miserable snake! What did he say to you? Did he threaten you?" "Nothing I have not heard before," Clara said, trying to sound unconcerned, though her voice still trembled slightly. "But Mr. Bridger intervened and purchased supplies for us, quite a lot of supplies, actually." Thomas's gaze swung to James with an expression of mingled suspicion and grudging gratitude. He was at that awkward age where boyhood was giving way to manhood, all long limbs and sharp angles, with the same dark hair and blue eyes as his sister, but a face that still held the softness of youth. "Why would you do that for people you do not even know?" "Because it was the right thing to do," James said simply, offering his hand, "and because your sister showed more courage in that store than most men I know would have managed." Thomas hesitated for just a moment before accepting the handshake, and Clara saw him try not to wince at the strength of James's grip. "Thank you, sir. We will find a way to repay you." "No repayment necessary," James said firmly. "Now, where would you like me to put these supplies?" The interior of the cabin was even more rough than its exterior suggested. A single room divided by a hanging blanket into two sleeping areas, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a rough table with two chairs in the center. The floor was dirt-packed hard by years of use, and the single window was covered with oiled paper instead of glass. But Clara had done her best to make it a home, with wildflowers in a chipped vase on the table and her mother's quilt folded neatly on one of the two narrow beds. James set the crates down near the fireplace and then went back for the remaining boxes, refusing all offers of help. When everything had been unloaded, he stood in the doorway surveying the cabin with an expression that Clara could not quite read. "You have done well making this place livable," he said finally, "but you need some repairs before winter comes. That roof will not hold up to a Montana snowfall, and those gaps in the walls will let in cold that could kill you both." "We know," Clara said quietly, embarrassed by the poverty laid bare before this capable stranger. "We are doing what we can with what we have, but materials cost money we do not possess." James nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "I might be able to help with that. I am looking for work myself, and I am decent with carpentry and general repairs. If you would be willing to trade food and a place to sleep for labor, I could get this cabin properly weatherized before the first snow." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "You would do that? But why? You do not owe us anything." "Maybe I am doing it for selfish reasons," James said with that slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth again. "I have been on the trail for 3 months, and I am tired of sleeping on the ground. A roof over my head and home-cooked meals sound like heaven right about now. Besides, I'm not quite ready to move on yet. Silver Creek seems like an interesting place to spend a few weeks." Thomas looked at Clara with hope blazing in his eyes, but she bit her lip, torn between desperate need and ingrained caution. Mr. Bridger, people in town already think badly of us. If you are seen staying here, even in the barn or a tent outside, they will assume the worst. Your reputation will be damaged by association with us." "Let them assume what they want," James said with a shrug. "I have never cared much for the opinions of people who judge without knowing the facts. My reputation has weathered worse than small-town gossip. I do not want to be responsible for causing you trouble." James stepped closer, and Clara found herself looking up into those honey-colored eyes that held more warmth than she had seen directed at her in months. "Miss Montgomery, Clara, if I may be so bold, I think you have been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders for far too long. Sometimes it is all right to accept help when it is offered freely. Sometimes it is all right to trust that someone might have good intentions without an ulterior motive." The tears she had been fighting all day finally spilled over, running hot down her cheeks despite her best efforts to hold them back. She was so tired, so endlessly tired of being strong, of fighting every battle alone, of pretending that she was not terrified every moment of every day that something worse was going to happen. "I do not know how to do that anymore," she whispered. "I do not know how to trust." "Then let me show you," James said softly. "One day at a time, one small step at a time. You do not have to decide everything right now. Just let me help with the cabin repairs and we will figure out the rest as we go." Thomas cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable with the emotional display. "I think we should accept his offer, Clara. We need the help, and Mr. Bridger seems like a decent man." Clara wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "All right," she said finally, her voice still shaky but determined. "But we do this properly. You will sleep in the lean-to behind the cabin that we can repair enough to make weather tight, you will take your meals with us, and you will accept pay in the form of whatever work I can find to do in town to earn actual money." "I will sleep in the lean-to and take meals with you," James agreed, "but I will not take money from you. Use what you earn to secure your future, not to pay debts you do not owe." It was clear he would not budge on this point, so Clara nodded reluctantly. "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Bridger." "James," he corrected gently, "I think we are past formalities at this point, do not you?" "James," Clara repeated, and the name felt strange and intimate on her tongue. "And you must call me Clara." "Clara," he said, and the way he spoke her name made something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude or relief and everything to do with the slow, sweet awakening of something she had thought dead and buried with her father. Over the following days, James proved to be a man of his word, and then some. He rose before dawn each morning and worked until the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold behind the mountains, repairing the roof with new shingles he somehow acquired, chinsing the gaps in the log walls with fresh mortar, replacing rotten boards in the floor, and rebuilding the lean-to into a small but sturdy structure that could house a man through winter. He worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent years doing hard physical labor, his shirt often discarded in the afternoon heat to reveal a back corded with muscle and marked with scars that told stories Clara did not yet dare to ask about. Thomas followed James around like a puppy, absorbing every lesson the cowboy casually offered about woodwork, animal husbandry, tracking, and 100 other skills that a young man needed to survive in this harsh land. Clara watched them together and felt her heart ache with bittersweet joy, seeing her brother respond to masculine guidance for the first time since their father's death, seeing him laugh again and stand a little taller with the confidence that came from learning new competencies. For her part, Clara threw herself into cooking meals that were more elaborate than anything they had eaten in months, using the supplies James had purchased to create dishes that filled the cabin with mouth-watering aromas. She baked bread and biscuits, stewed the ham with beans, made apple dumplings from dried fruit, and even attempted a pie that came out slightly lopsided but delicious nonetheless. It had been so long since she'd had enough food to cook with real creativity, since she had not been constantly rationing and calculating and worrying about where the next meal would come from. In the evenings, after the work was done and the dishes were washed, the three of them would sit outside the cabin watching the stars emerge one by one against the darkening sky. Thomas would usually fall asleep first, exhausted from a day of hard work, and then it would be just Clara and James talking quietly about everything and nothing, while the night air cooled and coyotes sang their wild songs in the distant hills. Clara learned that James had been born in Texas, the youngest son of a rancher who had lost everything in the aftermath of the Civil War. He had been just a boy when his family's land was seized for unpaid taxes, when they had scattered to the winds seeking survival wherever they could find it. He had worked as a cowhand, a trail driver, a ranch foreman, and even a brief stint as a lawman in a town so small it did not appear on most maps. He had seen the best and worst of people, had witnessed violence and kindness in equal measure, and had emerged from it all with his integrity intact but his faith in human nature somewhat battered. In turn, Clara told him about growing up in the mining camps, about a mother who had been cultured and educated but who had followed her husband into the wilderness out of love, about a childhood that had been materially poor but rich in affection and security. She told him about learning to shoot and ride and track from her father, about dreaming of becoming a teacher someday and having her own schoolhouse, about the plans she had been making before everything fell apart. "You could still do that," James said one night when she mentioned her abandoned dreams. "Become a teacher, I mean. There are always towns that need educated people willing to work with children." "Not towns where my name is known," Clara said bitterly. "The stain of my father's supposed crimes follows me everywhere. No school board would hire someone like me." "Then go somewhere your name means nothing," James suggested. "Montana Territory is vast, and there are new settlements springing up all the time. You could start fresh, be whoever you want to be." "And abandon Papa's memory? Let people believe the lies about him without anyone to speak the truth?" James was quiet for a long moment, his face shadowed in the starlight. "I understand wanting to fight for justice, but sometimes the cost of that fight is too high. Sometimes survival and moving forward matter more than vindication." "Is that what you did?" Clara asked, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. "Move on without fighting?" "I tried to fight," James said softly. "After my sister died, I went back to that town in Texas and confronted the people who had treated her so cruelly. I demanded they acknowledge what they had done, that they take responsibility for driving her to her grave. Do you know what happened?" Clara shook her head, though she suspected the answer would not be pleasant. "They ran me out of town at gunpoint," James said flatly. "Told me I was a troublemaker and a liar, said my sister had brought her troubles on herself. I could have stayed and fought, could have tried to force the issue, but I realized that nothing I did would bring her back, and getting myself killed would not honor her memory. So I left, and I have been moving ever since, trying to find a place where the past does not have such a stranglehold on the present." "Have you found it?" Clara asked. James turned his head to look at her directly, and even in the dim light she could see the intensity in his gaze. "I am starting to think maybe I have." The air between them seemed to crackle with sudden tension, with words unspoken and feelings that were growing stronger and more complicated with each passing day. Clara felt her breath catch in her throat, felt her heart begin to race with a mixture of fear and longing that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. "James," she began, not even sure what she wanted to say, but he shook his head slightly. "It is all right," he said quietly. "You do not have to say anything. I know this is complicated and the timing is terrible. I just want you to know that being here, helping you and Thomas, it has given me something I did not even realize I was missing. A sense of purpose, a feeling that maybe I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." Clara reached out in the darkness and found his hand, lacing her fingers through his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and strong, and holding it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I am glad you are here," she whispered, "more glad than I can properly express." James squeezed her hand gently, and they sat like that for a long time, connected in silence while the stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened around them. but their peaceful respite was not destined to last. On the 8th day after James's arrival, Clara and Thomas returned from checking their small trap line to find a man on horseback waiting in front of the cabin. He was dressed in expensive clothes that looked out of place in the rough surroundings, with a gold watch chain glinting across his vest and boots polished to a high shine. His face was narrow and shrewd, with small dark eyes that assessed everything and gave nothing away. James emerged from the cabin at the sound of their approach, and Clara saw his entire demeanor shift, his body going tense and alert in a way that reminded her he was more than just a kind cowboy doing repairs. "Can I help you?" James asked, his voice carefully neutral. The man smiled, showing too many teeth. "I am looking for Miss Clara Montgomery. I was told I might find her here." "I am Clara Montgomery," Clara said, moving forward to stand beside James. "What is your business with me?" "My name is Edward Thornton, and I am the regional manager for the Masterson Mining Company. I have come to discuss the matter of your father's land." Clara felt rage flare hot in her chest, felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. "There is nothing to discuss. You people murdered my father and stole his claim through fraud and fabricated evidence. I will never acknowledge your illegal ownership of that land." Thornton's smile did not waver. "Those are serious accusations, Miss Montgomery, accusations that could be considered slander. I would advise you to be very careful about repeating them, especially to someone in my position." "Is that a threat?" James asked quietly, taking a subtle step forward so that he was positioned slightly in front of Clara. "Not at all," Thornton said smoothly. "Merely friendly advice. But I actually did not come here to argue about the past. I came to extend an olive branch, so to speak. The Masterson Company recognizes that Miss Montgomery and her brother have suffered hardship regardless of the circumstances surrounding their father's death. We are prepared to offer compensation as a gesture of goodwill." "What kind of compensation?" Thomas asked suspiciously. Thornton reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. $500 in cash, along with a signed document releasing the Masterson Company from any future claims or legal action related to the land in question. A generous settlement, I think you will agree, for a piece of property that was barely producing. "You want us to sign away our rights to pursue justice?" Clara said, her voice shaking with fury. "You want us to absolve you of murder and theft for the price of a few $100s?" "I want to help you move forward with your lives," Thornton corrected. $500 is enough to relocate, to start fresh somewhere else. You could leave all this ugliness behind and build something new. Is that not preferable to staying here where you are clearly unwelcome?" Clara opened her mouth to tell him exactly what he could do with his blood money, but James spoke first. "I think you should leave now," he said, his voice gone cold and hard as winter ice. "The lady is not interested in your offer." Thornton's eyes narrowed as he looked at James with sudden, intense scrutiny. "And who might you be? I do not recall seeing you around Silver Creek before." "I am someone who does not appreciate watching a woman being pressured and intimidated on her own property," James replied evenly. "Now I have asked you politely to leave. I will not ask a third time." Something dangerous flickered across Thornton's face, but he clearly thought better of pushing the issue. "Very well. But the offer will remain open for 1 week. After that, the Masterson Company will consider the matter permanently closed, and you will have to live with whatever consequences arise from your refusal to be reasonable." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and an atmosphere of barely suppressed violence in his wake. "That was a threat," Thomas said, his voice tight with fear and anger. "He is going to do something to us." "Probably," James agreed grimly. "Men like that do not take no for an answer gracefully, but threats are just words until someone acts on them. And if they do, they will have to go through me first." Clara shook her head, fear clawing at her throat. "James, you cannot put yourself in danger for us. These are powerful people who have already killed once. I will not have your blood on my hands too." James turned to face her, reaching out to grasp her shoulders gently. "Clara, listen to me. I am not going anywhere. I am not going to let them hurt you or Thomas. Whatever comes, we face it together." "You barely know us," Clara protested, tears stinging her eyes. Why would you risk so much for people you barely know?" "Because I care about you," James said simply, and the raw honesty in his voice stole the breath from her lungs. "I know it is fast. I know the timing is complicated and difficult, but I cannot deny what I feel. You are strong and brave and compassionate, and you deserve so much better than what this town has given you. Let me be the person who stands beside you, who fights for you the way you have been fighting alone for so long." Clara stared up at him, her mind reeling. She wanted to protest, wanted to tell him he was being foolish, wanted to protect him from the danger that came with being associated with her. But more than any of that, she wanted exactly what he was offering: someone to lean on, someone to share the burden, someone who looked at her and saw Clara the woman rather than Clara the daughter of a supposed criminal. "I care about you too," she whispered. "More than is probably wise, given how short a time we have known each other, but I cannot deny that you have become important to me, that the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I cannot breathe." James's hands slid from her shoulders to cup her face with a gentleness that made her want to weep. "Then we are agreed. We stand together whatever comes." He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Clara found herself rising on her toes to meet him halfway. Their lips touched softly, hesitantly at first, and then with growing confidence and heat as the kiss deepened into something that made Clara's knees weak and her heart pound like thunder in her chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas made a gagging sound from where he still stood holding his rifle. "Do I have to watch this?" he asked in tones of exaggerated disgust. "Because I feel I should mention that I am still standing right here." Clara laughed, a sound of pure joy that felt strange and wonderful after so many months of sorrow. "Then perhaps you should go check the snares again, little brother." Thomas rolled his eyes, but headed off toward the tree line with a grin on his face that suggested he was not nearly as disturbed as he pretended to be. "I have wanted to do that since the first day I saw you," James admitted, his forehead resting against hers. "Standing in that store, so proud and strong even when the world was trying to beat you down. I thought you were the most magnificent woman I had ever seen." "I was terrified and humiliated," Clara said, but she was smiling. "You were magnificent," James insisted, "and you still are." They spent the afternoon working side by side, James finishing the repairs to the chicken coop they were building, while Clara worked on repairing their small collection of clothing, darning socks and patching shirts with thread James had quietly added to his purchases at the general store. It felt domestic and comfortable and right in a way that Clara had not experienced since before her father's death. But that evening, as the sun was setting in shades of crimson and gold, riders appeared on the horizon. Clara counted 5 of them silhouetted against the dying light, and her blood ran cold with premonition. "James!" she called out, and he was beside her in an instant, his hand dropping to the gun she had not even realized he was wearing until that moment. "Get inside," he said quietly, "both of you. Bar the door and do not come out no matter what you hear." "I am not leaving you out here alone," Clara said fiercely. "And I am not going to hide while someone threatens my sister," Thomas added, appearing with the old rifle their father had taught him to shoot when he was 10 years old. James looked like he wanted to argue, but the riders were close enough now that Clara could see they all had weapons drawn. There was no time for debate. "Stay behind me," James ordered, "and Thomas, do not shoot unless I tell you to. Understood?" Thomas nodded, his face pale but determined. The riders pulled up about 20 feet from the cabin, and Clara recognized 2 of them as men who had worked for the Masterson Mining Company, hard-faced individuals with reputations for violence. The man in the center was someone she did not know, but the silver star pinned to his chest identified him as law enforcement of some kind. "Miss Montgomery," the man with the star called out, "I am Deputy U.S. Marshal Jack Reynolds. I am here on official business regarding trespassing and illegal occupation of property." "This is the Hutchins property," Clara called back, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "It has been abandoned for months. We are not trespassing." The Hutchins property was sold at auction for unpaid taxes 3 weeks ago, Reynolds said, pulling out a document that he waved in the air. The new owner has filed a complaint about squatters and has requested that you be removed immediately. Let me guess, James said, his voice dripping with contempt. The new owner happens to be connected to the Masterson Mining Company. The new owner's identity is not your concern, Reynolds said coldly. You have 1 hour to gather your possessions and vacate these premises. If you refuse, I am authorized to remove you by force. This is outrageous, Clara said. Outrageous, Clara, her voice rising with anger. You cannot simply throw people out of their home with an hour's notice. There are legal procedures, rights that have to be respected. Your rights ended when you refused to pay for occupying someone else's property, one of the Masterson men said with a nasty grin. Should have taken Mr. Thornton's offer when you had the chance, Miss Montgomery. This is a setup, Thomas said, his voice shaking. They are driving us out so we have nowhere to go, so we will have no choice but to leave the territory. That is exactly what this is, James agreed quietly, and it will not work. He stepped forward, his body language changing in subtle ways that suddenly made him seem far more dangerous than he had before. Marshal Reynolds, I'm curious about something. Did you verify the authenticity of that property sale, or did you just take the word of whoever is paying you? Reynolds's face darkened with anger. You watch your mouth. Cowboy, I am a federal officer operating under legitimate authority. Then you will not mind answering my question, James said pleasantly. Did you check with the county clerk's office to confirm the sale was legal and properly recorded? Did you verify that proper notice was given to any occupants? Did you follow any of the standard procedures required by territorial law before showing up here with hired thugs to throw a woman and a boy out of their home? I do not answer to you, Reynolds snarled. No, but you answer to the federal government, and the last time I checked, they frowned on marshals who abuse their authority to do the dirty work of mining companies engaged in land fraud, James said, his voice going hard. I spent 2 years working as a lawman in Oklahoma Territory, Marshal Reynolds, and I know exactly what proper procedure looks like. This is not it. Reynolds's hand dropped to his gun, and Clara felt her heart leap into her throat. But James did not so much as flinch, standing his ground with the kind of calm confidence that suggested he had faced down armed men before and was not particularly impressed by the experience. Are you threatening a federal officer? Reynolds asked dangerously. I am informing you that I will be filing a formal complaint with the territorial governor and the U.S. Marshal Service regarding your conduct here today, James said evenly. And I will be happy to testify in any subsequent investigation about how you showed up with known criminals to illegally evict innocent people from their home. Now you can choose to follow through with this farce and deal with the consequences, or you can ride away and pretend this never happened. Your choice. For a long, tense moment, Clara thought Reynolds was going to draw his weapon, thought the whole situation was going to explode into violence that would leave some or all of them dead. But something in James's eyes must have given the marshal pause, because he finally looked away, swearing under his breath. This is not over, he said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Yes, it is, James said firmly. Whatever game the Mastersons are playing, it ends here. Miss Montgomery and her brother are under my protection now, and anyone who wants to harm them will have to go through me first. I suggest you take that message back to whoever sent you. Reynolds glared at him for another moment, then jerked his horse's head around and rode away. The Masterson men followed, but not before casting looks of pure hatred back at James and Clara that promised future trouble. When they were finally out of sight, Clara's knees gave out and she sat down hard on the ground, shaking with reaction. Thomas sank down beside her, looking like he might be sick, and James holstered his gun before crouching in front of them both. Are you two all right? He asked gently. You could have been killed, Clara said, her voice coming out higher and thinner than she intended. They could have shot you, and it would have been my fault. But they did not, James pointed out, and it would not have been your fault. It would have been the fault of greedy men who think might makes right. Were you really a lawman? Thomas asked, looking at James with something approaching awe. For about 18 months, James admitted. until I decided that the job required compromising my principles more often than I was comfortable with. But I learned a lot during that time, including how to spot corrupt officials and how to call their bluff. Will they really come back? Clara asked, still trembling. Probably not those specific men, James said thoughtfully. I do not think Reynolds wants the scrutiny that would come from an official complaint. But the Mastersons will try something else. They have invested too much in driving you away to give up now. Then what do we do? Clara asked helplessly. We cannot fight them forever. They have money and power and the law on their side. James was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then maybe it is time to change the game. Stop playing defense and start playing offense. What do you mean? I mean, we find proof of what really happened to your father, Sigurd, James said. We expose the corruption and the lies, and we make it impossible for the Mastersons to continue operating with impunity. It is a long shot, and it will be dangerous, but it is better than just waiting for them to destroy you. Hope flickered in Clara's chest for the first time in months. Fragile, but real. Do you really think we could do that? Find evidence that would stand up against their money and influence? I think it is worth trying, James said, and I think you deserve justice, not just survival. Clara looked at her brother, saw the same desperate hope reflected in his young face, and then back at James, who was watching her with steady confidence and something deeper, something that made her chest tight and her eyes sting with tears. All right, she said, squaring her shoulders and taking a deep breath. Tell us what we need to do. Over the next week, James proved to be as skilled at investigation as he was at carpentry and facing down corrupt lawmen. He started by talking to the few people in Silver Creek who had known Clara's father, the ones who had not completely turned their backs on his memory. He asked careful questions about the night William Montgomery had been killed, about the men who had been seen in the area, about inconsistencies in the official story that people had been afraid to mention publicly. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. Several people had seen unfamiliar riders in the hills near the Montgomery claim in the days before the murder, men who did not match the description of any known miners or ranchers in the area. One old prospector admitted quietly that he had found a campsite near the Hutchins cabin where someone had clearly been watching the Montgomery family for an extended period. And most damning of all, the blacksmith reluctantly revealed that he had been asked to alter brands on 3 horses just days before they mysteriously appeared in the Montgomery pasture. Why did you do it? James asked the blacksmith, a weathered man named Jim Cooper who looked ashamed but defiant. Because they paid me more money than I make in 6 months, Cooper admitted. And because they said if I did not help them, they would burn down my shop with my family inside. What would you have done in my place? I do not know, James said honestly, but I do know that you have a chance now to make it right. What you told me could help clear William Montgomery's name. And get me killed in the process, Cooper said bitterly. You do not understand what you are dealing with, son. The Mastersons own this town. They own the law. They can make people disappear, and everyone just looks the other way because they are too afraid to do anything else. Then help me change that, James urged. You have a daughter, do you not? What kind of world do you want her to grow up in? One where powerful men can commit murder and theft without consequences. Cooper was silent for a long time, wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he sighed heavily. I will think about it. That is all I can promise. It was not much, but it was more than they had before. James also managed to track down the clerk who had filed the paperwork for the supposedly legal sale of William Montgomery's claim. The young man was clearly nervous, glancing around constantly as if afraid of being overheard, but he confirmed that the signature on the deed had looked wrong to him, that he had been pressured by his boss to process the paperwork without the usual verification procedures. There is something else, the clerk said hesitantly. About a week before Mr. Montgomery was killed, a man came into the office asking questions about his claim. Wanted to know exactly where the boundaries were, whether there had been any recent assays done, that sort of thing. I am not supposed to give out that information, but he offered me $50, and I needed the money. Can you describe this man? James asked. The description the clerk provided matched one of the riders who had been with Deputy Marshal Reynolds, a man known to work regularly for the Masterson Company. Armed with this information, James made a trip to Helena to speak with the territorial governor's office and the head of the U.S. Marshal Service for the region. He was gone for 3 days, and Clara spent every hour of that time consumed with worry, terrified that something would happen to him or that he would simply decide the situation was too dangerous and not return. But he did return, riding into the yard at sunset on the 3rd day, looking tired and dusty but grimly satisfied. "I filed formal complaints against Deputy Marshal Reynolds and against the Masterson Mining Company," he told Clara and Thomas as they gathered around him eagerly. "The federal authorities are going to conduct an investigation. It will take time and there are no guarantees, but at least your story is now on official record, and the Mastersons will know they are being watched." "Do you think it will be enough?" Clara asked. "I do not know," James admitted. "But it is a start. And in the meantime, I have been thinking about what comes next." "What do you mean?" James dismounted and led his horse to the small corral they had built before turning to face Clara and Thomas directly. "I mean that even if the investigation clears your father's name, even if the Mastersons are held accountable, you two cannot stay here. There is too much bad blood, too much history. You need a fresh start somewhere else." "We have been over this, see," Clara said, her voice tightening with frustration. "We have no money to relocate, no prospects, nowhere to go." "That is not entirely true," James said slowly. "I have some money saved from the cattle drive, enough to stake a small homestead claim if we filed in the right place. And I have a letter from a friend in Wyoming Territory who says there is good land available near a new settlement called Rock Springs. They need families to establish farms and ranches, and they're offering incentives to settlers willing to put in the work." Clara's heart began to pound as she realized what he was suggesting. "James, what are you saying?" He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "I am saying that I want you to come with me, you and Thomas. I am saying that I want us to build a life together, a real life away from all this pain and trouble. I am saying that I am in love with you, Clara Montgomery, and I want to marry you if you will have me." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Clara stared up at him in shock. "You want to marry me? But we have only known each other for 2 weeks." "I know," James said, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "And if you need more time, I understand. But I also know that what I feel for you is not going to change whether it is 2 weeks or 2 years. I know that I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I know that I want to build something lasting with you, something good and true and worth fighting for." "James," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face now, "I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you that first day in the general store when you stood up for me without even knowing my name. And every day since then has only made me more certain that you are the man I want to spend my life with." James pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could hardly breathe. But she did not care because being held by him felt like coming home after a long, terrible journey. "Is that a yes?" he asked against her hair. "Yes," Clara said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will go to Wyoming with you. Yes to everything." Thomas cleared his throat loudly, and they broke apart to find him standing there with a grin splitting his face. "I hate to interrupt, but does this mean I'm getting a new brother-in-law?" "If that is all right with you, James said seriously. "I know I am not your father, Thomas, and I will never try to replace him. But I would be honored to be your family, to look out for you and help you become the man I know you can be." Thomas's grin faded into something more solemn, more genuine. "I would like that. And I think Papa would have approved of you, James. He always said the measure of a man was not what he owned, but how he treated people who could not help him in return. You have proven yourself by that standard." They were married a week later in a small ceremony performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Silver Creek. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved all these years, and carried wildflowers picked from the hillside. Thomas stood up as a witness, looking painfully grown up in a borrowed suit jacket, and the only other guest was Jim Cooper, the blacksmith, who had finally agreed to provide testimony about the altered horse brands and who seemed to take heart from seeing something good come out of all the darkness. The townspeople of Silver Creek stayed away, but Clara found she did not care. She had James's steady presence beside her, his voice strong and sure as he promised to love and cherish her for all their days, and when he kissed her at the conclusion of the ceremony, she felt joy break over her like sunlight through storm clouds. They spent their wedding night in the cabin, Thomas having tactfully decided to sleep in the lean-to, and Clara discovered that physical intimacy with a man you loved was something entirely different from the clinical descriptions she had received from her mother years ago. James was gentle and patient, guiding her through moments of nervousness and uncertainty with tenderness that made her love him even more. And when they finally came together in the oldest dance of humanity, Clara felt complete in a way she had not even known she was missing. The next morning, Jim Cooper appeared at the cabin with news that the territorial governor had ordered a formal investigation into the Masterson Mining Company and that Deputy Marshal Reynolds had been suspended pending review. It was not full justice yet, but it was progress, and it felt like vindication beginning to take root. They spent the following 2 weeks preparing for the journey to Wyoming, selling what little they had that was worth anything, packing supplies, and making arrangements. James purchased a sturdy wagon and a team of horses, and Clara carefully packed away her mother's few treasures, her father's mining tools, and every precious item that connected her to the family she had lost. On their last day in Silver Creek, Clara and Thomas rode out to the cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. They stood before their father's grave, marked only with a simple wooden cross that Thomas had carved, and Clara felt the weight of grief and love pressing down on her chest. "We are leaving, Papa," she said softly, placing wildflowers on the hard-packed earth. "We're going to start a new life in Wyoming, and I'm going to be happy. I hope you understand. I hope you know that I will never stop loving you, never stop believing in your innocence, but I also have to move forward. I have to live." Thomas knelt and pressed his palm against the ground. "I will make you proud, Papa. I will become a good man, the kind of man you were teaching me to be. And someday when I am grown, I will come back here and clear your name properly. That is my promise to you." They stood there for a long time in silence, saying their final goodbyes, and when they finally turned away, Clara felt a sense of peace settling over her. The past would always be part of her, but it no longer had the power to define her entire existence. The journey to Wyoming took 3 weeks, traveling through mountains and across plains so vast they seemed to stretch to infinity. It was hard traveling, with long days on the trail and nights spent camped under stars so bright they looked like diamonds scattered across black velvet. But Clara found joy in every mile, in the simple pleasure of riding beside her husband with her brother driving the wagon, in the knowledge that they were moving towards something rather than running away from something. James taught them both to handle horses better, to read the weather patterns, to identify edible plants and dangerous animals. He told stories around the campfire about his years on the trail, making them laugh with tales of mishaps and close calls. And at night, when Thomas was asleep, James would hold Clara in their shared bedroll and make love to her under the stars, and she felt more alive and complete than she had ever imagined possible. They reached Rock Springs in late September, just as the aspen trees were turning gold and the air was taking on the crisp edge that warned of coming winter. The town was raw and new, with buildings still smelling of fresh-cut lumber and streets that were more mud than road. But there was energy here, a sense of possibility that infected everyone who passed through. James filed a homestead claim on 160 acres about 5 miles from town, land with a small creek running through it and enough timber to build a proper house. The soil was good, the water was clear, and the mountains rising in the distance looked like sentinels standing guard over their new life. They worked from dawn to dusk, building a cabin that was larger and sturdier than anything Clara had lived in before, with real glass windows and a wood floor, and a loft where Thomas could have his own space. James built a barn and corral, and Clara started a garden that would hopefully produce vegetables before the first frost. It was backbreaking work, but it was work done for their own future rather than just for survival, and that made all the difference. The people of Rock Springs welcomed them with open friendliness that Clara had almost forgotten existed. Nobody asked about their past or questioned their reasons for settling there. They were simply accepted as new members of a community that was too busy building the future to worry about what anyone was running from. Clara found work teaching at the one-room schoolhouse that served the scattered homesteads in the area. The pay was modest, but it fulfilled the dream she had carried for so long, and she discovered that she loved working with the children, loved seeing their eyes light up as they mastered new skills. James hired on as a ranch foreman for one of the larger cattle operations, work that paid well and utilized all his years of experience. And Thomas, growing taller and stronger every day, divided his time between helping on their homestead and apprenticing with the town blacksmith. The winter was harsh, with snowdrifts piling higher than the cabin windows and temperatures that dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes. But they were prepared, with sufficient food stored and firewood stacked high. And there was something almost cozy about being snowed in together, playing cards by lamplight and telling stories while the wind howled outside. In March, when the snow was beginning to melt and the first brave crocuses were pushing through the frozen ground, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told James on a Sunday morning as they walked through their land, surveying the damage winter had done and making plans for spring planting. James stopped walking and stared at her, his eyes going wide. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," Clara said, suddenly nervous about his reaction. "I know we did not plan this so soon. I know we still have so much work to do on the homestead." James let out a whoop of joy that probably scared every animal within a mile and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to have a baby! Clara, we are going to have a baby!" His joy was infectious, and Clara felt her own happiness bubbling up to match his. They were going to be a family, a real family, and this child would be born into love and safety and hope rather than fear and uncertainty. Thomas took the news with the typical enthusiasm of a 15-year-old boy suddenly realizing he was going to have to listen to baby crying all night. But Clara saw the pleasure beneath his exaggerated groaning, saw the way he immediately started planning how he would teach his niece or nephew to ride and fish and all the skills he was learning. The baby came in November, a month early and in the middle of a blizzard that made getting the doctor impossible. Clara labored for 14 hours with only James and a neighboring woman named Martha, who had birthed 6 children of her own, to help. It was the hardest thing Clara had ever endured, waves of pain that made her scream and curse and beg for it to stop. But James never left her side, holding her hand and wiping her forehead and telling her how strong she was, how proud he was, how much he loved her. And then just before dawn, a new life entered the world with an indignant wail that announced his displeasure at being evicted from his warm home. James cut the cord with hands that shook slightly, and Martha cleaned the baby before placing him in Clara's arms. "A son," Clara whispered, staring down at the tiny red face, the impossibly small fingers that gripped her thumb with surprising strength. "We have a son, James." "He is perfect," James said, his voice rough with emotion as he touched the baby's downy head with one careful finger. "You are perfect. I love you both so much." They named him William, after Clara's father, with James as the middle name. Little William James Bridger had his father's dark hair and what would eventually prove to be his mother's blue eyes, and from the very beginning he ruled the household with all the authority of a tiny tyrant. Thomas proved to be a surprisingly attentive uncle, often volunteering to watch the baby while Clara caught up on sleep or helped James with outdoor chores. Watching her brother gentle with the infant, singing silly songs and making funny faces to elicit smiles, Clara felt her heart swell with gratitude for how far they had all come. Letters arrived periodically from Montana Territory bringing news that the investigation into the Masterson Mining Company had resulted in multiple indictments for fraud, murder, and corruption. Several company officials had fled the territory, and the federal government had seized assets pending trial. William Montgomery's name had been officially cleared with a statement from the territorial governor acknowledging that he had been the victim of a criminal conspiracy. It was vindication finally, even if it came too late for her father to see it. The years flowed past like the creek running through their property, sometimes rushing with the swift current of change and challenge, sometimes meandering peacefully through seasons of contentment. Clara gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter named Rose and another son named Thomas after her brother. The homestead prospered as James proved to be as skilled at farming and ranching as he was at everything else he set his mind to. They added rooms to the cabin, built a larger barn, acquired more livestock, and became respected members of the Rock Springs community. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and strong, with a gift for working metal that led him to open his own blacksmith shop in town at age 19. He married a sweet girl named Emily, whose family had settled near Rock Springs around the same time the Bridgers had arrived, and Clara cried happy tears at his wedding, seeing her baby brother so grown up and starting his own family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Clara on a trip back to Silver Creek. They rode into town on a fine spring morning, and Clara barely recognized the place. New buildings had gone up, new people had moved in, and the few old-timers who remained seemed surprised and pleased to see the former Clara Montgomery looking so prosperous and content. They visited her father's grave, which now bore a proper headstone with an inscription acknowledging his innocence and honoring his memory. The territorial government had paid for it as part of making amends for the injustice done to his family, and seeing his name cleared in stone brought tears to Clara's eyes. Harold Dawson's general store had closed years ago, Clara learned, after he had been implicated in the Masterson scandal. The new proprietor was a young couple from Missouri who had never heard of William Montgomery and treated Clara with the courtesy due any customer. They stayed only 2 days, long enough to lay flowers and say proper goodbyes, but both Clara and James were eager to return home to Wyoming, to their children and their land and the life they had built together. As they rode away from Silver Creek for what Clara suspected would be the last time, James reached over and took her hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving Montana, giving up the fight for your father's claim?" Clara thought about it seriously before answering. "No," she said finally. "What we built together is worth more than any gold mine, any piece of land, any victory over enemies who are not worth the energy of hatred. You gave me back my life, James. You gave me love and family and a future. How could I regret any of that?" "You gave me those things too," James said softly. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, going through the motions of living without really being alive. You made me want to be better, to build something lasting, to put down roots and grow something beautiful." They rode home slowly, savoring the journey, stopping to camp under the stars and make love like newlyweds despite 10 years of marriage and 3 children waiting at home. And when they finally crested the rise that looked down on their homestead, seeing the sturdy buildings and green fields and the smoke rising from the chimney where Martha was watching the children, Clara felt her heart swell with gratitude for the strange and wonderful path her life had taken. She had been refused service at a general store, had been at her lowest point, hopeless and afraid and alone, and a cowboy had bought her supplies and carried them home, and in doing so had carried her heart into a future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. The children came running when they spotted their parents returning, William now 9 years old and trying to act grown up, Rose at 6 still willing to shriek with excitement, and little Thomas at 4 barreling toward them with no regard for his own safety. James dismounted and scooped up all 3 of them at once, staggering under their combined weight but laughing with pure joy. Clara watched her family, her beautiful, complicated, perfect family, and felt tears of happiness streak down her cheeks. This was what redemption looked like. This was what grace felt like. This was the life she had been meant to live all along, and it had all started with one act of unexpected kindness from a stranger who became so much more. Years continued to unfold in their usual pattern of joy and sorrow, challenge and triumph. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated births and mourned deaths, built friendships and established traditions. William grew up to be a rancher like his father, with the same steady confidence and moral compass. Rose became a teacher like her mother, eventually taking over the Rock Springs School. Young Thomas followed his uncle into the blacksmithing trade, showing a talent for the work that surpassed even his namesake. Clara and James grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with years of sun and wind and laughter. They sat on the porch of their homestead on summer evenings, grandchildren playing in the yard, and talked about everything and nothing the way couples do who have spent a lifetime learning each other's rhythms. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, James stood up at the celebration dinner they had organized and raised his glass. 40 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his 70 years. I walked into a general store in Silver Creek and saw the most magnificent woman I had ever encountered being treated abominably. I bought her some supplies and carried them home for her. It seemed like a small thing at the time, just common decency. But that small act of kindness changed my entire life. It brought me Clara, and Clara brought me everything that matters: love, family, purpose, and joy. So I want to propose a toast, not to me or even to us, but to the power of kindness, to the courage it takes to help someone when the world is telling you not to, and to the unexpected miracles that can bloom from the smallest seeds of compassion. Everyone raised their glasses, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I love you," she mouthed silently to him. And he smiled that same smile that had made her heart flutter 4 decades ago. "I love you too," he mouthed back. And that love, born in a moment of crisis and nurtured through years of partnership and devotion, carried them through to the end of their days, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most ordinary acts of human decency lead to the most extraordinary lives. They lived long, full lives, James passing peacefully in his sleep at age 78, and Clara following just 2 years later, surrounded by the family they had created together. They were buried side by side in the Rock Springs Cemetery, their headstones simple but bearing an inscription that told their story. Here lie James and Clara Bridger, who proved that love and kindness can triumph over any darkness. And their descendants, spreading across Wyoming and beyond, carried forward the values they had lived by, passing down stories of the cowboy who bought supplies for a desperate woman and the love story that blossomed from that single act of grace. It was a good life, a full life, a life worth living, and it all started the day she was refused service at the general store and a cowboy bought her supplies and carried them home.